Great to be here this morning. I have to say I've been watching Code for America since its inception, and I've been very impressed by the increasing impact that the group has achieved. But what impresses me even more is the scale of the potential that Code for America has. And I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of some research that we've done. I run a research organization called the Center for the Edge. And one of the things we focused on is trying to understand what are the long-term forces that are reshaping our economic and society on a global scale. And we believe that there is what we call a big shift that we're in the middle of, or early stages of, that is going to transform economy and society. Part of it has to do with digital technology, the exponential improvement of performance in digital technology, and the connectivity that's being created as a result of these technology infrastructures. The boundaries that we've all grown comfortable with, whether they're geographic boundaries, industry boundaries, organizational boundaries, are beginning to blur at a significant level. And the implication of this, we believe, is that all institutions are going to have to fundamentally transform to survive, much less thrive, in the big shift. And we're not just talking about corporations, but government institutions, educational institutions, NGOs, all institutions are going to have to make a significant shift in this new world. And in that context, one of the things that we've come to believe is that this transition at one level is going to be extremely challenging and very painful for many people to go through this process. We're going to definitely be coming out of our comfort zones and moving into territory that we've never been in before. And in that context, we believe that to help make this transition, increasingly, we need high-impact movements to help us go through this big shift. Now, I've spent a lot of time actually throughout my life participating in movements of various types. I've also studied many movements in many parts of the world, including the Algerian War for Independence, the Mau Mau movement in Kenya for independence of Kenya. And what struck me as I've looked at movements over time, regardless of where they are in the world, the time that they're operating in, or the particular focus they have, successful movements have two basic elements that are common to all successful movements. And one of them is something that I call a narrative. And then the other element is something that I call a creation space, which has to do with how you organize the movement. And unfortunately, given limited time, I can't focus on creation spaces. I'll just talk about narratives as one of the key elements for high-impact movements. What do I mean by narrative? I guess, first of all, I need to make a distinction, because I think most of us, when we use the word narrative, it's kind of synonymous with story. Story, narrative, same thing. I want to make a distinction that I think is an important one. And it has to do with, first of all, in the context of story, the way I think about story, it has two components to it. One is it's self-contained. There's a beginning, a middle, and a resolution to the story. Something happens to resolve it. And then secondly, a story is about me, the storyteller, or it's about those people over there. It's not about you. You can use your imagination, think about what you might have done in the context of that story, but let's be clear, it's not about you. Narrative, in contrast, at least the way I define it, the two elements of a narrative, first of all, it's open-ended. There is no resolution yet. There's some kind of opportunity or threat out in the future, and it's big, but it's not clear whether it's going to be achieved or not. The resolution, it's open-ended. And the resolution of the narrative? The resolution of the narrative hinges on you. It hinges on the choices you're going to make, the actions you're going to take. You will play a role in resolving this narrative. What's it going to be? In essence, it's a call to action. And it takes all of us out of an increasing environment where we tend to be more passive, where we tend to be more reactive, and restore a sense of agency. We can make a difference. Now, when I talk about stories and narratives, often people say, well, you're dismissing stories and you're just focusing on narratives. No, I actually think these two operate extremely effectively together. If you think about it, and let me give you an example. I mean, the impact of narratives throughout history, I mean, we talk about the engagement of stories, the emotional engagement, remember stories very well. I'd like to respond that in the context of narratives, throughout history, millions of people have sacrificed their lives for a narrative. They've made the ultimate sacrifice. You want to talk about emotional engagement? Narratives deeply engage. And narratives take many different forms, and I'll go through a couple of examples of them. But again, in the context of the distinction between stories and narratives, a narrative can be very effective in providing a long-term sense of direction and opportunity, and to motivate and mobilize people to address that opportunity. The stories become really powerful ways to build credibility for the narrative. If you can tell some stories that talk about people who actually have already started moving and the kind of impact they've had in trying to achieve this opportunity, that's powerful. And the narrative makes the stories much more impactful, because now the story's not just some isolated story about some group of people over there, not clear whether it'll ever happen again or what the relevance is. No, the narrative provides context for the story and says, this is really just a small example of the opportunity that's ahead. So I think these two work very well together. Now, you can think about narratives at many different levels, and I've written about this in the context of individual narratives. I think each of us as individuals has a narrative that has driven our lives. Institutional narratives, a narrative for an organization, an institution. And then broader social narratives, religious narratives, political narratives, regional narratives, national narratives. I think a lot of the success of the United States was the American narrative about come to the land of opportunity. No matter what your background, no matter what your resources and capabilities, this is a place where you can achieve things that you would have never imagined. But you have to come here. Will you come here? Are you willing to come here? A call to action. Very powerful, and again, I think explains a lot of the success over history of the United States. In the context of institutional narratives, harder for me to find examples. When I talk to institutional leaders about narratives, they say, oh, we have a narrative. You know, we started with modest beginnings in a garage, we built some amazing things, we faced amazing obstacles, but we accomplished wonderful things. And I said, well, wait a minute. You know, that's a story about you. It's not a call to action. What's your call to action to the people you're speaking to? What's in it for them? Now, one example that I think illustrates the potential of a narrative in an institutional setting is actually Apple's narrative in the early years of Apple. It was condensed to a slogan of think different. But if you unpack that slogan, there was a dramatic arc of, for decades we had technology, digital technology that stripped away our names, gave us numbers, put us in cubicles, made us cogs in a machine. Now, for the first time, there's a generation of technology that can enable us to achieve our unique individuality and potential. But it's not a given. You got to think different. Are you willing to think different? Will you think different? And I think, ultimately, that's what drove the early success of Apple in terms of, for many people, Apple has become the equivalent of a religion. Because that was a very powerful narrative. And by the way, think about that high-level narrative. Apple isn't even mentioned in the narrative. It's about you and the opportunity you have, the people they're trying to speak to reach, to engage. And it spoke to them at a very deep level. It gave them that willingness to move and to stay loyal. Narratives over time have enormous power in terms of leverage. You can mobilize large groups of third parties. Learning, you can create vast ecosystems that learn faster than any individual organization can on its own. And you can create enormous loyalty through a powerful narrative. Now I'll say, many people just come to me and say, well, how do we do one of these narratives? And, maybe we should call up our PR department or our marketing group and get them to write us a narrative. No, resist that temptation. The effective narratives, the powerful narratives, emerge through action, and they're crafted through action. One of the reasons that Apple's narrative of Think Different was so powerful, think about Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. I mean, who were two individuals who thought different every day of their lives? They were living this narrative. They weren't just saying the words. And so reflect on the actions. Focus on what are the high-impact actions that we've taken, and how can we express what that opportunity is that's beyond. And what was it that motivated these third parties in this ecosystem that we're starting to build to go above and beyond to pursue that kind of opportunity? And pull it out of the actions rather than sitting in a room trying to craft the words and hoping that they'll stick. So I think there's a lot of opportunity around narrative. I just end with a couple of observations around what, in my mind, makes for an effective narrative. One of the criteria or filters has to do with the narrative should be consistent with the forces at work in the world. If you're crafting a narrative about an opportunity that is completely inconsistent with the way the world is moving, good luck. That's going to be a lot harder narrative to pursue. Focus on a narrative defining the opportunity at a high enough level so that you have a sense of direction and focus, but where you leave a lot of room for improvisation and experimentation and learning to occur in pursuing that opportunity. And be very realistic about the challenges and obstacles along the way. I mean, there's a reason why this opportunity isn't going to be automatically achieved. It's not easy. There are a lot of things that stand in the way, but if we come together, if we move together, we can overcome those challenges and obstacles, and that opportunity is worth the effort. So be very realistic about the challenges and obstacles along the way. So with that, I'll just say I think we are at a pivotal moment in history and global history, and I think there is an opportunity for high-impact movements to emerge to help us in that transition. And I can't think of an organization that's better positioned to drive one of those high-impact movements than Code for America. Thank you very much.